Everyone, this is our first hybrid event in East Central European Center, and tonight we have privilege to host the first event that is also sponsored by Njegos Endowment for Serbian Language and Culture here at Columbia University. And we have tonight with us Sandra Davidovic, whom I will introduce soon. And she will give a talk called From Liberalization to Expropriation, Post-Conflict Privatization of Socially Owned Enterprises in Kosovo. And I'll just explain a little bit format and announce our next event and introduce Sandra. And then after her talk is done, we will have my colleague, Professor Christopher Kess, introduce our today other's guest, Professor Woodward, and we will reconvene to at the table here and have this little discussion. So our next event I want to just announce will be on October 27th, and it's going to be another hybrid event. It's going to be a lecture by David Do Passo, who is our current Istvan Deac visiting professor, and he will give a talk called Muslims in 18th Century Habsburg Cities, the Social Integration of an Unincorporated Population. This is going to be a new perspective of new urban history and trans-imperial and global history in Central Europe. So, few words about our speaker today. Sandra Davidovic is a PhD candidate in International and European Studies at the University of Belgrade, and she's also a Fulbright visiting researcher here at the Harriman Institute. The core areas of her academic interest include contemporary Balkan politics, conflicts and peace studies, and doctrines of international interventions. She currently works as a research assistant at the Institute of International Politics and Economics in Belgrade, and prior to that she served as a teaching assistant at the Faculty of Political Sciences, also in Belgrade. Sandra is dealing with post-conflict studies in the Balkans for several years now, with particular emphasis on the problem of peace and state building in Kosovo. Between 2017 and 2018, she served as a project manager and researcher in projects supported by the Office of Kosovo of the Government of the Republic of Serbia, and carried out the studies Privatization of Socially Owned Enterprises in Kosovo under the auspices of the CUNY administration, as well as another research called The Decade of the Operation of the European Union Rule in Low Mission in Kosovo, EULEX, an overview, reviews, and conclusions. The studies were a result of intensive fieldwork in several municipalities in Kosovo and interviews with various actors involved in post-conflict processes. In addition, Sandra has authored and co-authored several research articles addressing the topic of Kosovo. So, without much ado, I will give the floor to Sandra. Please join me in welcoming Sandra.
If we're ready, I can start. Thank you all for coming here tonight, and thank you to those who are joining us via Zoom. I've checked that there are like 20 plus people that are watching this or via YouTube, but also the audience present. In the limited number, I have to say, but I'm happy that at least I will have a chance to see each other and to talk in person. I'd like to thank to Professor Bošković who made this possible event, and to East Central European Center for organizing it, and also I'd like to thank the Njegos Foundation for supporting it. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to be here at the Harriman Institute to within my Fulbright program and to present some of my research. Of course, I'd like to thank Professor Woodward, who has accepted our invitation to join us tonight, but also I'd like to thank you for your patience throughout the preparation of this event. And I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion, and of course I'm open to any of your questions. And with this being said, I guess I can start with the PowerPoint presentation that I prepared. I know that there are some arguments here about the disadvantages of using PowerPoint presentation, but still I have prepared, so I have to share this with you. And for me, it's a helpful tool and I prepared some photos that might be illustrative. So yes. So actually, before saying something about the structure, I'd like to say that the topic I intend to discuss today concerns the examination of liberal peace thesis and state building concept manifested in Kosovo's post-conflict privatization of social enterprises in particular. And I frame my research within peace building and state building analysis, having in mind that those concepts serve as the framework for the international engagement in Kosovo after 1999. Yet I argue that the applied agenda failed to achieve the set of goals illustrated in creating open, free, self-sustaining, multi-ethnic and inclusive environment. And on the contrary, as we will discuss later, it proved to make Kosovo even more dependent on it proved to make Kosovo even more dependent on international political and economic assistance. And with this being said, I'd like to share the overview of today's presentation. First, I will present that framework called the International State Building Agenda before we get to state building in Kosovo in particular, after which I will try to address the question of what makes Kosovo's privatization unique. And then you will hear my argument on the existence of two contested conceptions or approaches to not only post-conflict reconstruction in Kosovo, but also two approaches to privatization, which is the major topic for tonight's event. And based on that framework, I will discuss the system and the models applied in Kosovo's privatization and try to answer the question if the applied policies were congenial with the overall peace building agenda. And finally, we'll get to the point of expropriation, and hopefully we'll be able to understand how did we get from something that was intended to be a liberal peace building agenda to expropriation. Now let's briefly go through some conceptual parts of this state building story. I'll try to be short and concise. As I guess we all know here, state building as a concept stemmed from the post-Cold War emerged security perception or discourse that institutionally weak or fragile states or even failed states represents primary threat to international peace and stability. And therefore, the concept argues that a solution for such threats should be in building or rebuilding or simply improving those states, so to say, to make them less fragile. And the normative basis for the entire security discourse, I would say, represents liberal peace thesis that holds that the liberal democracies are simply unlikely to get involved in violent conflict. Therefore, the state building strives not to build any state, but liberal democracy, believing that such state secures peace and stability. And within this overall framework of state building as a framework, I'd like to emphasize the second part, as this is only my division, and it involves economic aspects, I would say, of state building, which is particularly important for today's topic, as it involves transforming the old economic structures into a market-oriented economy. And the core of the economic development policies having in mind the liberal peace thesis as the major theory that lies behind the concept involves market liberalization, privatization, and the overall deregulation. And this is why the concept serves very well in explaining the case of Kosovo, having in mind the topic of privatization. And now let's see how this framework was actually applied in Kosovo. I have provided a map just to help those who are not that familiar with the region, to check not only the territory of Kosovo, but also the nearby countries. And pretty much the framework that I presented was applied in Kosovo with, of course, some adjustments, having in mind the unique context of Kosovo. I'll just go briefly through a couple of major points concerning Kosovo's peace building. First of all, I'd like to put it into a category of peace building within or under international transitional administration. That's the first thing to say. And then there are a couple of events which I guess most of you know, but it's worth to remind ourselves that since 1999 and after the NATO war against Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Kosovo's territory was internationalized and put under the International Transitional Administration with the United Nations Interim Mission UNIC as I would say the umbrella organization for the entire international civilian presence. And we'll go through these events later. I just wanted to make a quick overview. And now it's good to check the mandate that was given to the international civilian administration in Kosovo. As you can see, the resolution 1244 that concerns the post-conflict Kosovo in a way confirms the substantial autonomy within the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. But what is even more important, and you can see in the bolded text, the resolution in a way confirms the relationship between developing democratic institutions on one hand and building peace, which in a way proves that the concept that I have just presented was implemented in Kosovo, although with certain adjustments that we're going to cover later. And of course, this task required the establishment of one of the largest and most ambitious peace building mission to that time, UNIC, with which enjoyed, I would say, unprecedented powers regarding its scope, structural complexity, but also budget involved. And as you can see, it was assigned to basically act as legislative, executive, and judiciary power. In other words, UNIC was kind of a state in Kosovo since 1999. And although UNIC established provisional institutions of self-government to induce power sharing and perhaps involve local population in peace building, the UNIC, but also the special representative as a head of the mission will remain the institutions of the utmost importance, at least until 2008. And now I must say that in addition to the United Nations, and I guess this is important for privatization, the international civilian presence in Kosovo involved other organizations as well. It was not only the United States that was, sorry, the United Nations that was in Kosovo, but also a variety of international organizations and agencies, as you can see, the European Union, OSCE, even World Bank and IMF, and a bunch of other actors. And why I'm saying this, each of those organizations have acted upon its own agenda, its own objectives and interests in Kosovo. So it was a challenge to, in a way, ensure a coherent approach to peace building in Kosovo. Therefore, the entire civilian presence was organized in 4-pillar structure, which with each pillar dealing with different tasks, as you can see, and with each pillar being led by different organizations. However, for the Kosovo's privatization, we're going to focus on the pillar 4, which was assigned to deal with economic reconstruction and development in Kosovo. And it was led and financed mainly by the European Union, which meant that the European Union was responsible for administering, but also for administering socially owned property, but also for creating privatization agenda. However, the European Union was not alone in this job. I have to emphasize that the Pillar 4 involved organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF, and the USA, which certainly affected the economic policies applied, and finally the privatization agenda. So we should focus on these four pillars as, let's say, institution that was responsible for implementing the entire process that we're going to discuss tonight. But before we start discussing privatization, I have to present my argument on the existence of two contested approaches to Kosovo's post-conflict reconstruction, which I think is important for privatization as well, and I'll show that later. But before we move on to privatization, I'd like to say that despite the defined peace-building mandate that we could see at one of the previous slides, UNIC was obviously involved in building some institutions, but there was no consensus around the state to which these institutions belong to. So the internationals were divided, in my understanding, on the final political settlement on Kosovo, which was illustrated in the question whether the peace building will result in Kosovo as an independent state on the one hand, or into an autonomous entity with certain degree of self-determination or autonomy within the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And on that question, I think this division, in a way, appeared from the very beginning of the UN administration in Kosovo. And the first conception was first approach was conceptually illustrated through the standards before status policy. So what does that mean? The first conception made the final political settlement conditional upon achieving certain set of governance benchmarks, let's say. And in the case of Kosovo, that included building rule of law, self-sustaining institutions, certainly the dialogue with Belgrade, and so on and so forth. The political conception, however, was more interested in, I would say, the fast political solution, which in my understanding was illustrated in Kosovo's independence. And I think that the existence of these two conceptions and their and the negotiations between those will affect not only peace building in Kosovo, but also privatization. And I argue that the standard before status policy, which served as some sort of a framework, was essentially abandoned in 2004. And that will be also important for privatization, having in mind the time frame of privatization as well. We'll see that later. And then in 2008, this shift towards the political conception was only confirmed by recognizing Kosovo's declaration of independence. This is only my understanding. We can discuss this later, but I think this is important because this division will appear throughout the process of privatization frequently, and it will finally affect its dynamic and the outcome. This is an interesting quote from one of the pillar deputy heads, which is a good introduction, I would say, for the next slide, which finally says something about privatization. So this is actually my attempt to answer what makes Kosovo's privatization unique. Namely, Kosovo's privatization, on the one hand, represents part of the overall transition that the former socialist countries have gone through, former socialist countries of Eastern Europe, mainly, but including the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So, in that sense, it shares some general threats and problems that those countries have encountered through that process. However, the fact that Kosovo represents both post-conflict, post-socialist, but also post-conflict environment made it in a way unique. And I think that the distinction between general and more specific, let us look at how this unique context of Kosovo has actually shaped the system of privatization, but also the process. And now we'll go through these features quickly. The first one concerns certainly the territory. So at the time when privatization was initiated, Kosovo was obviously not a state, which in general terms would be a framework for a privatization. So the second one concerns the government. And unlike more general cases in which government would oversee the process of privatization, in the case of Kosovo, the function of government was taken over by the International Transitional Administration, or UNIC in this case. And finally, the third feature concerns the choice of economic policies applied in one post-conflict society in transition. And unlike, again, more general cases in which the choice of privatization would be a result of either a social or ideological consensus or simply political party choice, in the case of Kosovo, privatization was simply part of the international state building or peace building agenda. And in that sense, it was in a way predetermined. So there was not a chance for local population to perhaps gather in parliament and discuss the privatization model they're interested to perhaps apply in the case. So with Kosovo's territory being internationalized, the entire system of privatization was mainly internationalized. And that's not even the end of the story. The last feature, I think, have created a lot of troubles for internationals in Kosovo, having in mind that the entire administration faced something that I think they have never either heard before, or they heard but they knew little or nothing about it, and that was socially owned property, a unique feature of Yugoslav market socialism that was, I would say, ambiguous even for the creators of that notion and of the Yugoslav constitutions. And now you can imagine how it was difficult to grasp the notion of socially owned property for internationals in Kosovo. It's good to mention that socially owned property was a unique feature of Yugoslav economic system, and it was different from, on the one hand, Western private ownership that we are familiar with, I guess, but also different from the Soviet state-owned property. So it was, as UNIC said, it was somewhere between the private and state ownership. And in order to understand the ownership structure of these socially owned enterprises, UNIC in a way tried to identify certain representatives of such property, because the fundamental idea behind the social property in Yugoslavia was that socially owned values belong to society, in a way to no one and to everyone. However, when you put that highly ambiguous definition in the context of post-conflict Kosovo, with everything that I have just presented, that have created a lot of problems in identifying first the ownership structure, and then the answering even when identified to some extent. And as you can see, UNIC in a way provided a possible list of representatives of that society by outlining municipalities, worker councils, and state. There was a huge problem of what makes Kosovo's society, how to define it, and finally, if the state should be considered as representative, perhaps, to which states to refer. Would it be Serbia or Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, or would it be Kosovo or UNIC as a temporary state? So this unique feature of Yugoslav property, together with Kosovo's post-conflict environment, raised a lot of problems, and finally posed the question, who has the property rights over socially owned enterprises, and finally, who has the authority to privatize them. And now, as you can see, the UNIC was assigned to, within its extensive authorities, it was assigned to administer property in Kosovo. But I think I have bolded the major point of this provision, which in a way highlights its right to administer, which was certainly not equal to its right to either dispose it or to change its ownership structure. And there was obviously a question, was UNIC even allowed to change the ownership right, having in mind this provision? And again, the conceptions that I mentioned now make sense because those two groups were again divided on how to actually answer the question of whether the unit has the right to change the ownership rights or not. And again, I have highlighted two major groups. The first one was mainly illustrated in Pillar 4, who was assigned to deal with economic reconstruction. And you can see some of the agencies within Pillar. Nevertheless, they were in favor of fast and comprehensive privatization, in my understanding, in any price. And the second conception was mainly illustrated by the Pillar 2 and the United Nations, especially its Office for Legal Affairs, which held that permanent change of property rights was beyond the interim administration. So the difference is in understanding the right of UNIC to actually privatize socially owned enterprises actually postpone the commencement of the process, but also affected, as we will see, the system that was created, and finally it will create a lot of problems throughout the process. And when it comes to locals, I thought it would be useful to mention that there were obviously differences between Serbs and Albanians in this regard. On the one hand, for Albanians, this was seen as something, I would say, they were simply supporting the privatization, having in mind that there was a widespread perception among Albanians that the post or the socialist legacy was simply discriminatory, and that the privatization will provide redistribution of resources not only from state to private hands, but also along ethnic lines. On the other hand, Serbia was obviously claiming that the entire idea and the concept was illegal. And it's interesting to highlight that Serbia, at the time when privatization was initiated, in a way restarted to pay part of its public debt that applied to Kosovo, which in my understanding illustrates the sovereignty question as the core question of privatization in Kosovo, since its position to continue to pay Kosovo's debt, despite the fact that it wasn't able to either collect taxes or to, in a way, despite the fact that it has lost of effective sovereignty over the territory, represents, I would say, the attitude of claiming its sovereignty over Kosovo, which highlights the political and economic matters when it comes to Kosovo. We can discuss that more later, but now I was really struggling, should I mention this? Would it take too much time? But I think we have to mention that one of the major theses regarding Kosovo's economy among internationals when they came to Kosovo and when they arrived and approached privatization was that the Kosovo enjoyed somewhat discriminatory status in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, especially after 1989 when Kosovo's autonomy was revoked. And it is important to mention that throughout the 90s, after the economy was revoked, the central authorities actually introduced already a privatization program which occurred between 1989 and 1999. And during that time, part of those socially owned enterprises that UNIC will deal with were already privatized. And this is really important once we come to privatization just to keep in mind. And yeah, one of the theses, for instance, that Rita Knudsen did in her report presented on the position of Kosovo in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia concerned the understanding that central authorities in a way kept Kosovo underdeveloped, I would say intentionally. And she based her argument on the thesis that Kosovo received less than other less developed republics through the federal funds. And also based on the gap based on the existing gap between certain parts of Yugoslavia, for instance, Kosovo, which was obviously less developed than Slovenia, which was much more developed. But this graph I wanted to show, we can discuss it, I guess, later, shows quite the opposite information on the participation of Kosovo in redistribution resources through the Federal Development Fund. Now I'd like to go to the system because I think the time is running out. We can discuss parts that I missed later because I really want to stay within the time limit. So having all this said, and having in mind the context of Kosovo, having in mind the highly ambiguous notion of socially owned property and the fact that UNIC had a lot of problems in identifying the owners of those socially owned enterprises, and having in mind that portion of those enterprises were already privatized in the 90s. The system established seemed to represent some kind of a compromise between the two conceptions. So the idea of UNIC, having in mind all that I've said, was simply to establish the new legal entity, and that's Kosovo Trust Agency, which was established by UNIC, but as an entity legally separate from UNIC, and it was assigned to exclusively administer socially owned property and thus to create privatization program. In addition, it established a special chamber of the Supreme Court that was authorized to deal with any privatization related claims. So with this bipartite institutional structure, UNIC thought that they have created a system that can allow finally them to start with privatization, but also to be somewhat legally distanced from the entire system, especially having in mind that Kosovo Trust Agency was legally independent. And the fact again that UNIC decided to start privatization without resolving ownership rights of those socially owned enterprises affected the selected models of privatization. The fundamental feature of the applied model of spinoff actually presumed separating assets from liabilities by creating a subsidiary company and then transferring only assets to new companies, after which those new companies were supposed to be sold, but the debts, or let's say liabilities, were supposed to be left with the old company. And I know it sounds a bit complicated, so I have created a map to understand how everything actually was organized. So this would be the old socially owned enterprises, but then for the purpose of making the entire process smooth and legally, let's say, possible, the KDA established a new company with slightly different name by adding DOO, and then these things should serve as an asset. So they were transferred to the new company while the debts were left to the old one. The new company were supposed to be sold on the tender, after which the proceeds from the sale would be kept in the fund, trustee fund, managed by the KDA, and then those funds were supposed to be divided as it follows. 20% were assigned for the workers of socially owned enterprises and 70% for owners and creditors, which reminds me of, again, going back to the old socially owned enterprises, because obviously both workers and owners and creditors were linked to the old one. So this is the map. I hope it helps you to understand how the model actually looked like. And now I will go through really quickly through three major phases. Obviously, I don't have time to discuss each of those phases thoroughly, but I will highlight a couple of events that in a way illustrated all of the associated problems with the system that was designed and the models that were supposed to be applied. And I have, among a variety of events, I have chosen the two events. The first I named the case of Maria Fucci, and it illustrates a legal crisis related to Kosovo's privatization. And the second one concerns Kosovo's declaration of independence in 2008, which concerns the political crisis that actually questioned the entire international management in Kosovo's privatization. And based on these two events that I have chosen, I have divided the process into three phases. Each of those phases are really, really interesting. So let's start with the first one. So actually, I have to say that the entire privatization process was actually announced in New York, here, not in Pristina. That was really funny to discover. And it says a lot, I guess, about the political atmosphere in which the privatization started, especially having in mind tense relationship between the United Nations, the European Union, and other countries involved. And it started actually very well with the two first waves and 27 companies sold. But then the KDA stopped everything, as they say, given legal uncertainties that was in their report. And actually, this is how we get to the problem of 1990s transformation that I mentioned before. I wish I could have more time to elaborate on those transformations, but we'll have the discussion apart for that. The thing was whether to recognize the 1990s transformation or what was perceived as Milosevic privatization, or simply to disregard them. And again, those two groups have different understandings of how to approach that. And this is why I have chosen Maria Fucci as the KDA director, who surprisingly, having in mind that she was a member of the KDA, contested the entire model, saying that those transformations, unlike the most, I would say, dominant approach of the complete disregarding of the 1990 transformation, she offered somewhat moderate perception that those transformations should be considered valid unless solid proof were found that they were not either that discriminatory or in violation of applicable law. She was, of course, highly criticized, and finally she was fired after this entire phase. I mean, this is just really summarized story. But the reason why I have chosen her is because that she was fired, as it was explained, due to the establishment of illogical operational policies. And having in mind what she proposed, I argued that her proposal or perception was far more logical from the perspective of the international state builders' accountability. Meaning that if this, let's say, assess of the automatic non-validity of transformation was external measure, it was something that was, in a way, imposed by UNIC, then it was up to UNIC to assess in each particular case whether the transformation should be applied or not. We'll see how the one legal problem produced the another one. Namely, this case was actually just one second. I have to. Yeah, actually, the problem of those transformations became real when two American businessmen lodged legal challenges in New York, contesting that the KDA is privatizing something that was already privately owned. And that's when the KDA actually realized that the problem is becoming real. Okay. And now we should go back to the way the KDA was established, and it was established as a entity legally separate from UNIC and the rest of the United Nations. So when the decisions on whether to recognize transformation or not was to be, done, when they had to start doing their job, they realized that they're not protected by the UN immunities because they were legally separate from the United Nations. And that's when another division, especially this time between the UN and the UA and the EU, I would say, escalated because the EU, as the majority of the Pillar 4 was with the EU members, asked that they also should enjoy UN immunity, but that was rejected. And this created an 18 months long stalemate of a privatization process, which is why the first phase is named as the legal crisis. And now how the entire problem and the crisis with immunities and transformation was resolved lead us to the second phase. And again, it's, I would say, illustrating, and it says something about the way internationals were dealing with problems concerning Kosovo's unique post-conflict environment. Namely, instead of granting immunities and perhaps re-examining the entire economic approach in Kosovo, what OMNIC has done was simply that they have changed regulations. So the regulation on the establishment of the KDA was amended by the new regulation, which said that the KDA is required to determine ownership, meaning to decide whether to recognize or disregard transformation after certain enterprises were privatized or liquidated, depending on the model applied. So in a way, this is how did we get from liberalization expropriation, because the simple fact that that case that I mentioned about the legal, the businessmen claiming that KDA is in a position to privatize something that has been already privatized, and then by changing this rule saying that it doesn't even have to decide the status before it starts privatization, resulted in a way, put them in a situation to be perhaps hold liable for illegal expropriation. And that was confirmed in the OSCE report on privatization from 2007, that as they say, this change might violate international, I guess, human rights by being or violating European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, as privatization may result in expropriation without the necessary safeguards and compensation. In a way, the simple question of whether to recognize or not to recognize questions obviously opened a plethora of legal problems, affected the efficiency of the KDA members, and finally faced them with the possibility of being held liable for privatizing something that has been already privatized. And of course, what I've learned through my field work, that some of them even decided not to go to work because they were afraid that they will be involved in some legal risk operation, perhaps if they just keep doing the old way. Anyway, by adopting this new regulation and with the intervention of the special representative, the entire process was sped up. I have mentioned that the old management was fired in a way. So the second phase was actually pretty successful, having in mind that almost more than 100 enterprises were sold, and you can see some of the proceeds. It's going to be interesting to compare them with some other privatization cases and perhaps to compare them with Kosovo's public debt. And the last part is, I guess, the less interesting because in a way, it goes beyond the research period that I'm mainly focused on, that's until 2008. But still, the fact that Kosovo declared independence, in a way, questioned the entire international management of privatization process, but also it produced clash of two different legal frameworks. The first one, within which privatization was organized, was based on Resolution 1244 and the subsequent UNIC regulations. And as we said, the two major bodies involved were Kosovo Trust Agency and Special Chamber, and both of them were operating under the Resolution 1244. On the other hand, when Kosovo declared independence and the new governments took over, the new constitution was adopted, and then the new law on privatization, which in a way presumed that an old Kosovo Trust Agency will be replaced with a newly established privatization agency that was responsible to Kosovo Assembly rather than to UNIC. And now there is another interesting feature in this case, and I will finish with that, I guess, before making some conclusive remarks, that despite that we have completely two different regimes and mutually obviously exclusive, there was no new law on establishing the new court, perhaps. Simply Kosovo's government decided to, in a way, involve special chamber as part of their newly established legal framework, which in a way is a bit paradoxical because special chamber was a body that was established and was established under the Security Council Resolution 1244, and it was responsible to the special representative. However, on the other hand, the entire system of the newly created agencies were responsible to Kosovo's constitution and thus Kosovo's assembly. And now these are some numbers of the assessments of privatization provided by the Njegos Institute, but also by Serbian Office for Kosovo. Sorry. So I have compared some of the data. And it was interesting, what I mentioned before, the total of proceeds in 2008, the final number will be obviously different since the privatization continued after 2008, but perhaps the total proceeds that you can see in 2008 for Kosovo privatization was 383 million euros, which I guess is quite bad, having in mind that one company was sold in Serbia privatization for $508 million. So that's just an illustration for me. I'm not an economist, obviously, but it was interesting to compare those things to understand what was the economic value of privatization. Even low income, or let's say even low proceeds, had no influence over Kosovo's economy, having in mind the proceeds were capped, or let's say frozen, in 88 fund. So basically they were stuck in a fund, and those proceeds were supposed to be, as I have presented, to either workers or owners and creditors once they're determined or identified. And there are a couple of interesting examples, but unfortunately we don't have much time to talk about. Let's mention that later. I just wanted to make some quick conclusion, having in mind the overall not only privatization goals, but the peace building goals, and to try to answer the question of whether the applied model that I have presented was actually congenial to the overall peace building agenda in Kosovo. On the one hand, one of the major critics towards Kosovo's economy was that the entire economy was highly dependent on the central Yugoslav authorities. However, Kosovo's economy still remained, I would say, to be dependent on, although this time the center seems to be changed. And then I think that the entire process was actually part of peace building and then state building agenda. And in that sense, I understand it at least as part of gaining economic sovereignty in addition to political sovereignty that was in a way an illustration of that political approach that I have mentioned. And Dominic Zhang had presented in his book interesting facts about structural similarities between Kosovo's economy in the period that was mostly criticized by internationals, and then in 2010, which in a way represents the ending point of international-led privatization. For instance, about 200,000 people were employed in total in both period of times in the public institutions. So the employment hasn't really changed, having in mind the public institutions. Other than that, the privatization had little influence over the pretty devastating indicators of Kosovo's economy. As you can see, some of the numbers illustrating the level of poverty, but also the employment or unemployment rates. And in terms of the overall economic environment, I don't think the privatization has really played a significant role in improving Kosovo's economy. I would just repeat my thesis from the very beginning that Kosovo's privatization was part, or let's say predetermined strategy of international state building, and in that sense, I would say it served as a tool in achieving political and economic goals illustrated in creating more independent Kosovo. And when I say more independent, I mean from the rest of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. As you could see, that its dependence on the international economic and political aid is still questionable. So with this being said, I'm not going to make any huge conclusions. I guess these are the open questions, so we can actually discuss them more. And obviously I missed some parts, but I promised to stay within time limit. And so now we can discuss those things. And thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, but also if you feel that I need to clarify something that I've mentioned, I'm more than happy to do it.
Sandra, if you would please, I would just invite you to take your seats, and Chris, it should be allowed to just introduce Professor Woodward.
No, what's the program? Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sandra, for that fascinating presentation on the economic and legal and political challenges faced by contemporary Kosovo and the privatization process and the state building process. And I'm looking forward to a rich discussion on that topic. And to get our discussion started, I would like to welcome Professor Susan L. Woodward here from the City University of New York, from the graduate program at CUNY. And we're extremely fortunate to have her here tonight as a discussant on this topic, since Professor Woodward is one of the premier experts on the Yugoslav transformation and on the politics and society and economics of post-Yugoslavia, the post-Yugoslav Balkans. Professor Woodward has many publications to her name, and I'll just mention two of them. Her major studies of the region. One, The Balkan Tragedy, Chaos and Dissolution After the Cold War. That was published by Brookings Press in 1995. I'm sorry, I wanted to mention three books on the region. With Socialist Unemployment, the Political Economy of Yugoslavia coming first, and then The Balkan Tragedy, Chaos and Dissolution After the Cold War. And then finally, The Ideology of Failed States, Why Intervention Fails. Sounds like a very relevant title and comment on the presentation that we had tonight by Sandra. Professor Woodward has also been an advisor for the United Nations Committee of Experts on Public Administration, and she has also served as an advisor to the security mission in the the former Yugoslav republics in the 1990s, and continues to serve as an expert and an advisor on many committees and in the capacity of expert on the region. So we'd like to welcome tonight Professor Susan Woodward to discuss Sandra Davidovic's fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I won't claim to be an expert on post-Yugoslav. There are more people in the room, including especially Sandra, than I on that. But at any rate, I'm so pleased to be here to comment on this extremely important paper. And once you all have a chance to read it, to the book from which it comes. I begin with her fundamental thesis that contrary to what one might think, and the literature in general assumes, the international policy of privatization, and not only in Kosovo, by the way, is actually an integral part of state building by international actors. She then demonstrated in great detail and rich primary research, which I hope you'll be able to get access to. We need more of that wonderful examples, that the outcomes of this privatization policy question the very normative basis of the international agenda, which claims that the aim of state building interventions is to establish liberal democracies, as she told you today, mainly on the liberal peace thesis. While I am persuaded completely by her evidence about the outcomes, I would argue that they, the international actors, never said this was the goal, nor do many of them think it is. Rather, I would argue, it is the academic and policy-oriented academic community that posits this aim, not the intervening actors. Even if one looks at the United States, which does sometimes insist on building liberal democracies, unlike most of the other actors involved. President George W. Bush, for example, talked about this in terms of the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, although not at the beginning, that wasn't their aim then either. The US also aims at building liberal economies, of which the privatization agenda is paramount, especially for the US Agency of International Development. I have argued for many years and in many public forums in Washington that these two goals, liberal democracies and liberal economies, are actually in contradiction, with the economic agenda undermining the democracy agenda, and that US officials and agencies always choose the economic agenda as their priority. Sandra does, however, show that the international actors, in her case in Kosovo, are not in agreement. It's not a homogeneous group. She showed substantial differences, for example, between the United States and the international financial institutions, the IMF and World Bank on the one hand, and the United Nations, except for some SRSGs like Harry Holkeri and some EU actors on the other. It's also interesting to learn that the special chamber about which you've now heard was able to use the European Convention on Human Rights and Individual Freedoms to reverse some of the Kosovo Trust Agency decisions after the egregious new regulation in 2005, about which you've heard. And that regulation was to return to the list of socially owned enterprises to be privatized up to 1989, not during the 1990s. Nonetheless, the decisive actor in her story, which you haven't heard so much today because she had to limit what she was saying, the decisive actor is the United States. In that regard, I am especially curious to know how the staff and personnel of the Kosovo Trust Agency were selected, who was appointed and how, given that its director and the EU staff lost in the battle, largely with the US and for political reasons, as Sandra has persuasively argued and you heard tonight, over whether to recognize socially owned enterprise privatizations during the 1990s. The next thing that I found particularly interesting in her study and discussion was that privatization in this international project was not of property only, but also of decisions that many of us should think should be made public. Being private, they cannot easily be challenged, as in the rare case she tells us about special chamber's decision, which I just mentioned. but the decisions on the starting price of enterprise assets to be negotiated, who has claims. In discussions, you may be willing to tell us more about the terribly sad story of Filin Guga, whom she listed in the list, other decisions by the Kosovo Trust Agency, and I'm sure she can give us other examples. They are all taken privately, behind closed doors. Those who know about the role of the International Monetary Fund and its negotiations with countries all over the world will find this familiar. All behind closed doors, but on issues of major public consequence. So I think we should be concerned. Not to speak, of course, about the supposed agenda of building a liberal democracy, which is, by definition, a political regime that is supposed to be accountable to citizens. We could go on, as she told you today, it's also an issue of international accountability. In regard to Sandra's disagreement, you haven't heard about this, so I'm just going to let her tell you more, but she disagrees with Rita Knudsen, who also did a study of privatization in Kosovo, about why privatization was resumed and sped up after the 2004 riots in Kosovo. For Knudsen, it was because of the population's economic frustration. For Sandra, it was a change in the international agenda in favor of status. In this case, I agree with Sandra, and I want to offer an explanation for why that international change took place. As I have written in an article in the journal Sudost Europa in 2007, and now I'm going to do another egregious, I'm going to quote myself. The real objective, just so you know that this was written in 2007, not now. The real objective of the push to resolve the status question, in fact, was the economic crisis predicted by the IMF and the World Bank during 2004 for the following year of 2005. And thereafter, as a result of growing donor disinterest in Kosovo and declining aid on the one hand, and the sovereign limits, meaning no sovereign authority of Kosovo, the sovereign limits on alternative sources of finance for public expenditures and investment, to those plummeting from donor grants, remittances, and customs revenues on the other. A shift of obligations from international assistance to foreign borrowing and investment, according to the IMF, required clarity on Kosovo's sovereignty. Membership in the international financial institutions, beginning of the IMF, thus resolution of Kosovo's portion of Serbia's international debt, and an end to property disputes with Serbs and Serbia over socialist era property rights so as to attract foreign investors. And you've heard already a great deal about this. So that's what I wrote in 2007. The purpose of promoting Kosovo's independence, in other words, was economic, not political. Indeed, specifically financial. Now, in conclusion, she said a lot that I want to comment about the role of foreign debt, which you haven't heard. So I hope she'll elaborate more to tell you, because this is a fascinating part of her story. But her story about foreign debt and the role of Serbia paying a portion of Kosovo's international debt without compensation or even recognition. I have three comments to reinforce her general argument that international actors should have embedded Kosovo in the history of the former Yugoslavia. I strongly support her criticism of the international actors for ignoring Kosovo's context. First, she tells us, to her surprise, in fact, and I'm repeating now what you've already heard, but I think it's important to do, that, quote, the structural similarities between Kosovo's economy in the 1970s and 1980s and in 2010 are striking, unquote. And that the data on employment in 2010 were roughly the same total as in 1981, even though Kosovo's population had grown by a quarter, that the numbers for those living in poverty or even extreme poverty and those without employment are, quote, figures in the same order as what Kosovo faced at the end of the 1990s. I propose myself that there is more continuity here than just the Kosovo political elite and the sad economic results for Kosovars. That is, these data tell us when this story starts. namely at the beginning of what was called the world debt crisis, starting in 1979, when the major commercial banks and the international financial institutions radically increased their lending rates and conditions, and the disastrous consequences for almost all developing countries in the 1980s because of the program of structural adjustment loans that the bank and the fund then imposed for repayment and the conditions, which, as some of you may already know, with Yugoslavia, one of the worst victims. It is the story, as I wrote in two of the books that were nicely cited, of the end of Yugoslavia. So I consider it very important to continue to pay attention to the role of international debt for Kosovo now and also for Serbia and other parts of the former Yugoslavia. Second, on the debt issue, it's worth remembering that the International Conference on Former Yugoslavia, established in September 1991 under the chairmanship of Lord Carrington, and 3 months after the declarations of independence by Slovenia and Croatia, and then institutionalized in August 1992 under the joint chair of the United Nations and the European Union, with Cyrus Vance and David Owen in the chair at that point. But it was established to manage the process of dissolution as the Slovenes persuaded the international community to call the end of Yugoslavia. The conference created 6 standing committees. One was how to distribute responsibility among the federal units for the Yugoslav foreign debt. This committee, which Slovenia actually requested in August 1991, was then led by Robert Badinter, the French jurist. For reasons that I have never understood, Badinter was then asked by the European Union in December 1991, when Germany was pressured to recognize Croatian independence, to assess the terms for recognition of all the federal republics who requested it. Why did a committee tasked to assess responsibility for the debt become the decisive voice on independence and sovereignty? I do not have an answer, but I do see the parallel in Sandra's story. Third, and to me the most important conclusion I draw from this truly important work, is that state building is more than international management of state formation of a newly independent state and the politics surrounding independence and its supporters, but also a story of state formation for the country left diminished. That is, this is a story of separation and secession on the own. So we should not be analyzing the situation in Kosovo alone, but also in Serbia and the consequences of privatization for Serbia, again, as an act of state building, as Sandra identifies so beautifully. To continue to talk about the political conflict as one of ethnic conflict or national rights for Kosovo Albanians gives priority to the Kosovo story, but we should find a way to talk about the Serbia story too. While I found the information about how Serbia has been paying Kosovo's debt without any recognition by international actors, despite its efforts, to be truly disturbing, this story raises a more general issue that I had not considered in analyzing international state building projects myself until I read Sandra's paper. For example, what happens to Spain if Catalonia secedes successfully? What about the United Kingdom if Scotland goes? Sandra raises a significant lacuna in the literature on international state building that is seriously worth considering, although it's not about privatization in Kosovo per se, it's what she's learning and telling us as a result of her very interesting study.
So much. These are two wonderful exposés and researches. So I'll just give word to Sandra if you want to respond to some of the comments that Professor Woodward raised. And we also have a few questions that I see on our Q&A of Zooms that I want to also pose later on.
Okay, yes, thank you, Professor. First of all, thank you for your time to thoroughly read my paper. and to present some of the things that I've missed to do during my
Well, you
presentation.
didn't have time.
Yeah.
You did, yeah.
I guess it's because of PowerPoint. Anyway, I'm honored that you found my arguments worth of consideration and that you agree with a majority of them. I like your comments as well, especially your elaboration on the importance of the March violent riots against Serbs and other non-Albanians, and that thesis of Rita Knudsen saying that there was economic frustration among Albanians that pushed for a shift towards more political approach, which, as I said and you have highlighted, was in my understanding mainly about the already decided shift, and the privatization was there only to follow what was politically predetermined in a way, or at least decided at that time. So once the shift happened, and of course your elaboration on the international context and the problem of the economic crisis are beyond my capability of understanding the problem, but certainly it has something with my argument that it actually pushed the international community, and I think that was a strategy of Albanians, pretty much successful strategy of triggering attention. At least that was, I would say, a local initiative of, and I think that the entire event was not that much against Serbs as much as it was against UNIC, having in mind the widespread dissatisfaction among Albanians for not having state already.
Right.
So in that sense, I really like your comment. It's something that I think I've read something like that in one of your articles, but I couldn't connect it with my argument. And other than that, of course, if there are some questions, we can extend discussion, but I simply don't have anything to add but to say thank you. I really appreciate, and I'd like to say that 2 years ago, I was so happy to get your book on state building. At that time, I was starting to write my dissertation, and that was a great thing for me to have that book in Serbian academic community. We lag some of the literature, as you may know. And now I was thinking that I'm sitting here with you and discussing the state building in Kosovo, which is not that related to my paper, but it says something about how the economic paths are really interesting, and that and how honored actually I am to be here tonight. So thank you.
Did you find out how the Kosovo Trust Agency staff were selected? Because it's interesting that it's mainly EU staff, but at the same time, they're the ones who then went against the 2005 regulation and supported the 1990s privatization.
Yes, that is the question that you posed, and I found interesting. Honestly, no. What I've learned from my talks in Kosovo was that the Europeans were responsible, and that the head of fourth pillar was mainly from the European Union. However, the deputy head was mainly from the US or person related to the contact group. So in a way, officially the UN was leading the fourth pillar, but there was always someone behind to, in a way, intervene in case the head of the pillar is acting too independent, if I may say that way. As for the staff, I'm not sure, but I know that the case of Maria Fucci was really interesting for me, as she was accused for being Serbian agent because she was involved in Serbian privatization. And, public perception in Serbia about privatization was not the favorable one. We were not, I guess most of the population wasn't happy, so she was not seen in a positive way in Serbia as well. But it's been, I think the way the European Union actually assigned their stuff for me will become more interesting once the EULEX was established. And the EU started to, I would say, impose itself as a more prominent actor on the ground. And that's another level of complexity of transferring authorities from the UN to the EU, and the way how everything was done is even more interesting, which is, but that goes beyond the the topic of privatization. But yeah, I don't have any idea how did they actually select them in person. I guess I was following the websites, and usually they have like open positions, even these days for ELIX, for example. I applied just to check how it works. But I don't know how they make decisions. So it's in a way open, but again, and also for those higher position, I guess I wouldn't be able to apply.
Thank you.
I'll use just opportunity to ask two questions in one from our audience on Zoom. So Ermin Mujezinovic, who is a MAR student here at Harriman, he's asking, does privatization lead to more or less corruption, in particular to Kosovo? And Isidora Poplazic, who is, I guess, your colleague, is research assistant at the institute where you also are, with which you're associated. She's saying, thank you for the inspiring lecture, and she's asking similar question regarding the role of the EU in this process, as well as whether the privatization has been the subject of any of negotiation process you mentioned.
Okay, let's start with the first one, and I guess Professor maybe can add something. But what I found through my research is that in 2011, as far as I remember, there was an interesting data from the report of Andrea Lorenzo Capusella, who served in the International Civilian Office as the head of economic unit, and he provided a comprehensive report on the Kosovo's state of pretty much everything at that time, and he said that corruption actually increased, especially after the EULEX was established. In 2011, he shared really interesting information that actually around 5% of Kosovo population is in some way involved in organized corruption, which is, having in mind the number of people living in Kosovo, it's pretty decent number. As for the European Union and the question about whether the issue of privatization was part of any negotiation process, I must say no, so far. Apart from Ahtisaari plan that in a way presume two solutions for the socially owned and public owned enterprises, and in a way even mentioned the question of debt, and that's the first time one international proposal on the Kosovo's political settlement actually highlighted the problem of debt. The plan actually proposed that part of privatization proceeds should be used for Kosovo's international debts, but not retroactively, meaning that Serbia wouldn't get anything at the end of the day. And these days, as we know, the European Union is the one who mediates the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina, but since 2012, let's say, the issue of property rights simply remain out of agenda. What I know is that the EU recently announced that among its priorities will be property rights and the problem of missing and displaced persons in Kosovo, which I hope to be on agenda, but having in mind its achievement so far, I'm not that optimistic about the final outcome.
I'll just use opportunity to ask one more question. So Radmila Nakarada asks, and partially Professor Woodward, you responded this referring to your 2007 article. She asked, what brought on the shift from peace building to state building in 2004, a shift that delegitimized the UN resolution 1244. But if you want to add anything else to that, for both of you.
Well, I think I mentioned something about that. The CUNY report, and that's a report that was provided by the Secretary General Special Representative on the situation in Kosovo after the March riots, in a way recommended that shift from, in my understanding, shift from standards before status policies to status oriented policy, which in my understanding was a transformation from peace building to state building, although it was not explicitly said, but the report itself is pretty illustrative in my understanding about the shift that happened. And with your argument on the international financial crisis and the reduction of the international aid for Kosovo, and then what came later was the widespread recognition of Kosovo's independence in a way proves that thesis. But that's only my understanding. And I think that the report is highly illustrative in that regard.
We have another interesting question that maybe is outside of
Could
the
I add just
period.
a little
Oh,
more on
sure,
that
yes,
before?
yes.
Is that okay? Do we
Yeah,
have
sorry,
time?
yeah.
And sorry,
I'm just-
I'd like to say hello to Professor Naka, that she's actually the one who connected Professor Woodward and me. So I'm really happy to have her with us tonight.
Wonderful to be there.
Yes.
We'll say hello. I think it's an interesting question. I don't have an answer to this, but an interesting question of what the intention of the international community was in 1244 in June 1999.
Mhm.
You're saying it was peace building, and then it becomes, I would say, if it's only peace building, it's moving way before 2004 towards state building. The transitional administration is already a form of state. But when we think that 1244, the preamble, some people often don't know this, the preamble of a UN resolution is the most important thing to look at. And the preamble was written by an American lawyer who had been in the team at the State Department through this whole period. And he wrote it in a way to say, well, this is a transitional period. We won't decide whether, as you said today, autonomy versus statehood. But it was written in a way that it was very clear that they decided on statehood already. But there then is, from 1999 to 2004, with Kayaida's report and what Altasari is doing, I see quite a struggle going on the international level, to which standards before status by Steiner, the German diplomat, who then becomes head of the UN at that point, is a kind of compromise between the two positions that are fighting it out on should it be autonomy or should it be in statehood. Because remember, there are lots and lots of countries that still to this day won't recognize Kosovo's independence. There were many in the, certainly Russia and the Security Council was not in favor. And so you can imagine it was a big struggle going on. So to me, what you're seeing over that period is slowly but surely explicit state building, but that in many ways it was already intended by the people who end up deciding the outcome, meaning the United States, as state building.
I agree.
Thank you for clarifying that on that point as well. There is another question that is more pertinent to the contemporary moment. I don't know whether that is under a period that you're looking at. Question is, how is the Biden administration's position on this different from the Trump administration's, and to what impact?
Well, honestly, I'm not sure, because I think that, as I said, privatization remained largely neglected by not only political representatives, let's say, but also even in academia. And having in mind the shift in administration, it was difficult to notice any difference in that regard. What was interesting last year was that Washington agreement that was introduced by the Trump administration. That was something new after many years of, I would say, pretty inactive policy of the U.S. Concerning Kosovo. As I said, I think that the EU is trying to play a more important role, at least to some extent. I guess that one would say that it's doing it on behalf of the United States, but anyway, it becomes to be a more prominent role. Last year, during the Trump administration, especially in the second part of his mandate, I think that the U.S. Demonstrated the new interest for the problem of Kosovo to some extent, which resulted in signing that Washington agreement, whatever the purpose of that agreement was. I couldn't catch it. And with Biden administration now, I'm not sure. I guess it's pretty early. I wasn't that optimistic after I watched the I think it was the Committee of Foreign Affairs that was organized in the late 2020 with I think it was Daniel Server, Madeleine Albright, and many other people who had some experience in dealing with Kosovo. So they were discussing the future of the Balkans now when the new administration took over, and they had some general remarks, but I can say concerning them that I wasn't that optimistic. Other than that, I think, well, in a way, this is pretty much finished job. So I don't think that if unless Serbia decides to do something about its entire process, I don't think anything will change. And I think that the change of the U.S. administration doesn't really make any huge difference in this regard. At least that's how I think.
You know, my own view about what the contemporary situation is more a question of what's happening politically within Kosovo. Because one of the things that, you know, you were very clear, your research goes up to 2008. But you do tell us that after 2008, the Kosovo Trust Agency was replaced by a government, Kosovo government, private, it's called Privatization Agency of Kosovo, and responsible to the assembly. And one of the things that was so interesting in your discussion about the continuity that I then pulled out all the way back to 79, and of course, the Albanian Kosovo demonstrations in 80, 81 as well, which I didn't want to take too much time for, but you mentioned the continuity in terms of the ruling class, the ruling elite, especially the political elite in Kosovo. Well, this year we've had a change.
Yeah.
And so it would be very interesting to me. I know you haven't done that research, but have you thought about or even got a sense of whether there's more change going on because now we have a change in the political party?
Yeah, we have a change in political class in Kosovo.
That's what
yes. It's interesting, actually. Yes. Now, when you say that, I certainly have some expectations, having in mind the part of privatization problem concerning the implementation of the Supreme Court decision or Constitutional Court decisions. And I'd like to highlight one of the examples concerning the decision of the Kosovo Constitutional Court on the land that was in a way returned to Dečani Monastery, which was confirmed a couple of times, but then it wasn't implemented since 2016. And these days we could at least read in Serbian media that there is a certain degree of pressure from the U.S. administration towards the new government in Pristina to finally implement the decision, which is valid for more than 5 years now. So in that sense, and having in mind the new governments and in particular Kurtić orientation towards more rule of law, towards respecting rule of law and generally his legalist way of dealing with Kosovo's politics, it's going to be interesting how that will affect privatization. But on the other hand, his position is really firm concerning property and the side, the Pristina side or the Kosovo side claims that all movable or immovable property is something that belongs to the state of Kosovo, and with the law that confirm in a way registration from the old socialist and socially owned and publicly owned property on pretty much transforming the ownership towards Kosovo as a republic this time, confirms their orientation to simply keep Serbia out of the further dealing with privatization. And it's going to be interesting how they will deal with publicly owned enterprises, having in mind that the ownership in that case is more, I would say, clear, because the publicly owned enterprises were established by the either federal or republic or local entities within the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Still, with that law, it was pretty clear that Kosovo, in a way, reapplied territorial principle that was confirmed in the agreement of succession Although Kosovo was obviously not part of that agreement, but it seems that that will be the policy, at least when it comes to privatization. But as I said, it's going to be illustrated to see how the Dutch case will be resolved finally. That's maybe a good sign.
Great.
Yeah, Dragiša Mijačić from the Institute for Territorial Economic Development is asking what is the legal ground for privatization agency of Kosovo to be a successor of the Kosovo Trust Agency?
Well, I guess the very same legal ground that served for transferring the entire international administration from UNIC to newly established system of Kosovo's state. So there was no legal ground in my understanding. And in a way, when the Kosovo's privatization agency was established, UNIC immediately rejected its establishment by saying that the resolution 1244 remained in force, and that the Kosovo Trust Agency remained the only responsible institution for privatization in Kosovo, responsible to the special representative of the Secretary General. So in that sense, it's very difficult to identify any legal framework. Of course, from the perspective of Kosovo, and I guess that the legal framework would be Kosovo's Declaration of Independence that involved a market fishery plan, which was legally unbinding document, and it was informal and unconfirmed in the Security Council, but still it was involved into a legal system of Kosovo and Kosovo's institution. So with these three documents, that would be the legal framework from the perspective of Kosovo. However, from the perspective of the international law, the only way to replace Resolution 1244 and the subsequent regulation would be to adopt new resolution in the Security Council, right? Right. And that didn't happen so far, which is why UNIC still operates in Kosovo, at least in a limited number, but in a way it serves as the status neutral actor.
It'd be interesting, the story you told of the two American businessmen that the Wall Street Journal report told about. It'd be interesting to see if in this interim, until, we don't know, Kosovo is recognized by the United Nations, and then it would have legal status, right? Where legal challenges to the cases that have taken place, the privatizations over the last 10, 15 years happen, because then it would, whatever the court that they go to, I mean, you will tell us more about that, they'll have to make a decision. Is an answer to this person's question.
Yeah. And he has a follow-up question. And do you see the legal responsibility of UNIC, who got a mandate to administer movable and immovable property of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and Serbia?
Well, I guess that's a question for the Serbian government, how they will approach the UNIC's mandate responsibility. I guess that the UNIC will not reevaluate its own role and achievements in Kosovo. There are a couple of mechanisms that I would think of, but I guess it's not up to me to make recommendations for the Serbian government tonight. But yeah, I guess it would be interesting to have some legal body established by the United Nations to simply assess, maybe not to judge over its responsibilities, but simply to assess finally what was their mandate. Now when the process ended up and most of the documents are actually open and accessible.
We have one question from the audience.
Yeah.
You want to introduce yourself as well?
I'm Sinead. I'm a PhD student at Columbia, and I'm really, really interested in both of your researches, and particularly with the argument that Sandra presented and then Professor Woodward contested a little bit, but in a very interesting way, that like this political conception of state building and liberal democracies connected in some way to the question of privatization and liberalization in markets, right? Liberal politics versus liberal markets. And also the comment that Professor Woodward made about this question of why a sort of body responsible for judging financial debt-related responsibilities might also be weighing in on the question of independence, which seems like a political question, not an economic one. I was just wondering if either of you had any comments about your sort of thinking about what kinds of political frameworks, like theories of sovereignty, perhaps not liberal democracy, are really associated with this idea of liberalization, particularly because it seems like in Sandra's story, the question of Kosovo's sort of independence and isolation, its sort of de-federalization almost, seems to be kind of part and parcel or almost like functional to the process of privatization for international markets. And I guess just to frame why I'm asking this question, I just saw a talk by Professor Adam Gediciu today, who was talking about sort of world-making projects in the anti-colonial and decolonial movements in the post-war period, and how federation actually was conceived of as this kind of way of limiting the effects, the competitive effects of the global economy, and creating sort of functional economic systems that were resistant to basically neoliberal decisions made by the IMF and things like that. So it seems like these questions are the political and the economic.
Professor, thank you.
I guess I'll first ask the question of, I didn't hear who this professor was, who you heard.
Adam Gediciu. She's a theorist of anti-colonial movements in the post-war period, and her book is called World Making After Empire, but she's sort of talking
Oh,
about
yes,
these.
yeah, no, I know.
Yeah,
I know who you're talking about, thanks. I just,
Words.
I keep reading her name and I hadn't heard it, it's pronounced, so why I was, her work is on, as you rightly said, on especially African, but also Caribbean political actors in the course of decolonization to create not only federations within countries, but among countries as a way of fighting. It wasn't yet, I wouldn't call it was not yet neoliberal economics in the way we talk about it now.
That was the.
I mean, that was a period, for example, in Western countries of Keynesianism, right? But global capitalism, definitely. So that is really a different period from the one you're asking about now. So I don't know how we could connect them. I mean, my story is that, for example, the U.S. Agency of International Development, USAID, whom I mentioned in my comments, has been running privatization programs everywhere. I studied it in Moldova and in Mozambique. I mean, and this is, somebody should do a study of why they have so much power, right? In terms of outcomes. Now, of course, it's financial because it's assistance. But in the programs I know about, they go in and very early and just start doing these programs. And then people who are being affected, whether it's farmers in the land or workers in a socially owned enterprise, have to react against the terms of their established body, USAID. So I do see the American hand on this very strongly, including, of course, through its role in the IMF and the World Bank. But
Right, so it's like it's American interests that are the spoiler and not necessarily their conception of sovereignty or their attachment to this kind of idea of fragmented or decentralized.
that's my understanding of what, but that's what I see. So I don't know if other people have a different idea.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I remember your point. And when you were talking about that, and now it reminds me that I was actually struggling when I was presenting framework, if there was a framework that was in a way used by academia to explain certain policies. They do say concept in academia serves as a language to communicate, right?
Yeah.
So I was juggling between whether the concepts were actually those used by scholars or whether that was an official politics of internationals. And it was difficult to divide because sometimes scholars were involved in providing some research for internationals involved. So
Yes.
it was difficult for me to separate those things entirely, and also I had to choose certain conceptual framework to deal with the topic. But I'd like to share something way more interesting when you remind, let's say, then you all ask me, at least Sinead, and you asked me to share more of my field research. I have a lot of great memories from Kosovo. I love being there. Obviously, this is one of the pictures of me being there. And I remember one thing after I had a really great talk with Deputy Minister of Justice at that time. He was a young a lawyer speaking 3 languages, Serbian, Albanian, and English, and he was really a well-educated person, and I had really a great time talking to him. And he obviously knew a lot of legal things about Kosovo privatization, but also he knows those stories from the ground, you know, how criminal groups were connected to politicians, and then the local politicians were connected to internationals, and a bunch of those things where you realize that you know pretty much nothing after you read your books and articles, and then you go to Kosovo. But the most important part of that talk was when he was, when I was leaving his office, and that was in the Ministry of Justice, and then he said something, if I remember, but it was like, now, Sandra, everything that I told you was really, you know, correct, and you should keep that in mind. But don't forget that, don't forget where you're now. And he pointed out to the office that was across his office, and I noticed that there was a USA sign, and he told me, this is the office that actually makes final decisions in this ministry. And the real Ministry of Justice is inside this office and not that one. And I was like, okay. So that was an interesting story that helped me to realize the context and to always keep in mind that all these legal regulations were one thing, but when they were applied and having in mind the environment in which those rights were supposed to be achieved, and the widespread discrimination. And I have to mention also the fact that the still unresolved problem of Serbian refugees that never came back to Kosovo, in a way illustrates how legal regulation meant little when you couldn't simply enjoy and your rights in a real life. And that's the case of Filin Guga that you mentioned, but also many other cases that I have learned about. Illustrates that one thing was on the paper, but completely other thing was for the people who were part of that process.
And one of my students did her dissertation on the role of property in post-conflict countries. So it wasn't specifically privatization, but who, so she compared Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Cyprus. And I'm only bringing it up to say that at least in the Cyprus case, I haven't been following these specific aspects of Bosnia, though I'm now embarrassed for myself that I haven't, because now I'm going to ask, but at least in the Cyprus case, this is going on at the European level of the European Court, of the Council of Europe. It's been going on for like decades. And when these get, so it's not only what happens to people where it's not settled, but several generations will go by.
Right.
I think we are reaching the point where we should throw.
Can I ask just one question?
Sure.
Yeah. I was curious about something that both of you mentioned, and that is the Serbian buying up of the Kosovo debt. I just wonder, what are the long-term ramifications of that? I mean, what's the intention or the possibilities? I think that Professor Woodward, you mentioned that it's sort of in an ominous context almost.
And I also noticed if we look at the numbers, it's just about 50% of the debt.
But it's not buying up, it's they're paying
Hey, okay.
what the world expects them to pay, because it was part of the resolution by the standing committee of what Serbia had to do when Kosovo was still a part of Serbia. So with that, but then Sandra can tell you the rest.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure what the ramification will be long term, because Serbia is still paying that debt, and I have that data from August 2017, where Serbia repaired part of the debt that applies to Kosovo in the total amount of about 650 million euros. And that was pretty much the similar number of the comparing to the entire proceeds of Kosovo's privatization. And interestingly, I guess for this question would be to mention that at some point World Bank decided that Kosovo will become part of the organization, and then only with one letter simply informed Serbia that it was not anymore responsible for paying that part of the debt, but didn't mention anything about repaying what had already been paid in the period between 2002 and 2015. I'm not sure when Kosovo became part of the World Bank, but that was one of the ramifications that I think concerns the sovereignty problem. But again, I think that the position of Serbian government is simply that they don't want to give up, because giving up on paying public debt, and public is something that states in a way guarantee as a state, confirms its official politics of non-recognizing Kosovo as an independent state.
It's like a foot in the door or something like that, or leverage or something.
Yes, and it's interesting that the debt will be due by 2041. So it's going to be long-term ramifications. So we'll see. We'll see what. I mean, I don't think anything will actually change. So they will just keep paying. The other party will just keep ignoring it.
I just want to thank Professor Woodward and Sandra for such a wonderful discussion and presentation, and thank you for coming, and thank everyone online who was with us. I hope to see you on 27th when we have our next event. Thank you.